The air in Aurelia was not merely air, it was a carefully curated atmosphere, thick with the scent of old money, leather, and a faint, earthy whisper of truffles shaved over handmade pasta. It was an environment designed to insulate its patrons from the vulgarity of the outside world, a gilded cage where billion-dollar deals were whispered over the delicate clinking of silver cutlery against bone china. Light did not simply illuminate the room. It dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, shattering into a million tiny diamonds that danced across the polished marble floors and the surface of impossibly expensive wines. In this world, Ilara Vance was a ghost, a silent, efficient presence in a crisp black uniform, her movements precise and economical. She moved between tables like a phantom, refilling water glasses before they were empty, clearing plates with a practiced grace that rendered her utterly invisible. To the titans of industry and finance who frequented Aurelia, she was less a person and more a function, a seamless part of the restaurant's flawless machinery, and that was exactly how she needed it to be. For beneath the veneer of the deferential waitress was a mind that burned with a fire they could never comprehend. Ilara lived a life of stark, brutal duality. Her body may have been serving seared scallops to hedge fund managers, but her soul was elsewhere, wandering through the hallowed halls of memory, back to a time of linseed oil, turpentine, and the warm, reassuring presence of her father. She could still feel the phantom weight of his hand on her shoulder as he guided her gaze across a canvas, teaching her to see not just the image, but the story of the brushstrokes, the soul of the artist laid bare in pigment and texture. He taught her that a true masterpiece had a heartbeat, a rhythm unique to its creator. Her mind, a repository of academic rigor from a PhD she was forced to abandon, held a near-encyclopedic knowledge of 19th-century French post-impressionism. She could identify an artist's work not just by their signature, but by the way they rendered light on water, the specific chemical composition of their favorite cerulean blue, the subtle, almost imperceptible hesitation in a line that betrayed a moment of doubt. This knowledge, once her greatest joy, was now a secret burden, a constant painful reminder of the world that had been stolen from her. The reason she endured the silent condescension and the grueling 16-hour shifts was a single, unwavering image that was seared into her consciousness. Her father, lying in a sterile white bed at the Northwood Rehabilitation Center. The man who had once stood tall and proud, his gallery a respected institution for 3 generations, was now a fragile shell, his world shrunk to the rhythmic, monotonous beeping of a heart monitor. The stroke had been devastating, triggered by the stress and public humiliation of utter financial ruin. The shame had broken him more than the bankruptcy. Every dollar Ilara earned, every polite nod and feigned smile, was a small payment against the mountain of medical debt that threatened to swallow them whole. Her life had become a grim calculus. 100 plates of risotto for an hour of physical therapy, a week of tips for a single vial of essential medication. This quiet, desperate fight for his survival was the fuel for her fire, a noble purpose hidden behind the anonymous facade of a waitress. It was a promise she had made to him in the silent, antiseptic-smelling corridors of the hospital. She would not let him be forgotten. The arrival of Alistair Finch was not an entrance, it was a conquest. The carefully maintained hush of Aurelia fractured as he swept into the private dining room, flanked by an entourage that scurried in his wake. He did not walk so much as cleave a path through the opulent space, his presence a vortex of raw, unapologetic power that bent the atmosphere around him. The maitre d', a man who regularly greeted senators and royalty with unflappable poise, seemed to shrink, his posture becoming almost obsequious. Finch was a man carved from sharp angles and cold ambition, his bespoke suit a piece of armor, his eyes the color of a winter sky, scanning the room not with appreciation, but with the cold assessment of an asset manager valuing property. He did not acknowledge the staff, looking through them as if they were inconvenient pieces of furniture. To him, the world was divided into 2 categories: predators and prey, assets and liabilities. Ilara felt a familiar chill crawl up her spine as he passed. a primal recognition of a predator she had encountered once before, though he would never remember it. In the center of the private dining room, hung like a religious icon in a sacred temple, was Alistair Finch's most prized possession. It was a painting by the fictional master Jérôme Dubois, titled Soleil couchant sur la Seine. It was a magnificent piece, a riot of sunset colors clashing against the deep blues of the river. To the untrained eye, it was a masterpiece, a testament to the artist's genius and the owner's immense wealth and taste. Finch often used it as a tool of seduction and intimidation, a monument to his own success. As Alara performed her duties, her eyes were involuntarily drawn to it. She wasn't admiring its beauty. She was reading its history, her mind instinctively deconstructing it layer by layer. The confident impasto strokes, the signature in the bottom right corner, the subtle craquelure of the aging varnish. But the longer she looked, the more a cold, sickening feeling began to coalesce in the pit of her stomach. The cerulean blue in the water was too vibrant, too stable for the 1880s. The signature, while a near-perfect imitation, lacked the fluid, arrogant flourish of Dubois' later works. It was a whisper of wrongness, a discordant note in a symphony that only she could hear. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City. But first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. Alara's focus was so intense, so absolute, that she momentarily forgot her place. She stood frozen for a fraction of a second, too long, her gaze locked on the canvas across the room. It was all the opening Alistair Finch needed. A cruel, self-satisfied smirk spread across his lips. He saw not a woman with a universe of knowledge in her mind, but a lowly servant girl, gawking at a treasure she could never hope to understand, let alone possess. He raised his voice just enough for the entire room to hear, turning her into a spectacle for the amusement of his guest, a potential investor he was trying to impress. He gestured towards her with a dismissive flick of his wrist, his tone dripping with condescending mockery that was as sharp and cold as ice. The sound of his voice was like a physical blow, snapping her out of her analytical trance and back into the harsh reality of her position. "Admiring something you'll never afford, dear?" Finch's voice boomed, slicing through the quiet ambiance. "The closest you'll get to a masterpiece like this is wiping dust off its frame. Do try not to smudge it." His guest chuckled, a sycophantic, nervous sound. Finch, basking in the attention, turned to the painting and began to lecture, his words a clumsy, arrogant display of feigned expertise. He pontificated about the artist's Parisian phase, misattributing the work to a period Dubois spent in Provence. He spoke of the revolutionary use of pigments, completely oblivious to the anachronisms that screamed at Alara from across the room. Each word was a fresh insult, not just to her, but to the art itself, a desecration of the history she held so sacred. He was a man who owned beauty but possessed no understanding of it, a dragon hoarding gold it could never appreciate. He saw only the price tag, the status it conferred, and the power it gave him over others. As the venom of his words washed over her, the gilded room seemed to dissolve around Alara. The smug face of Alistair Finch faded, replaced by the pale, drawn face of her father in his hospital bed. She saw the ghost of the vibrant, passionate man he once was, his eyes now clouded with a permanent haze of defeat and shame. She remembered the day the news broke, the word forgery plastered across headlines, destroying their family's name, a name that had been synonymous with integrity in the art world for nearly a century. Finch's casual cruelty was not just a random act of arrogance, it was a direct echo of the very force that had shattered her world. The insult wasn't about her uniform or her job. It was an attack on her father's legacy. In that moment, years of suppressed grief, silent fury, and quiet desperation crystallized within her. A fury, cold and solid, solidified in her veins, not hot and chaotic, but precise and controlled. Her hands, which had been trembling slightly, became perfectly still. Her breathing, once shallow with shock, slowed, becoming deep and deliberate. The invisible waitress, the ghost in the machine, was gone. In her place stood Elara Vance, daughter of Arthur Vance, the prodigy who could read the story of the brushstrokes. Finch concluded his pompous, inaccurate lecture with a final, dismissive wave in her direction, a silent command for her to disappear. "Now, if you'll excuse us," he said, turning his back on her completely. He had made his point, asserted his dominance, and considered the matter closed. He had used her as a prop, and was now ready to discard her. It was his fatal error, the one all arrogant men eventually make. The profound, complete, and utter underestimation of the person they believed to be beneath them. He could not see the lifetime of knowledge behind her eyes. He could not see the righteous, calculated anger that had just been forged into a weapon. He saw only a waitress. And as she took a single, deliberate step forward, the entire balance of power in the opulent room was about to shift on its axis, a silent earthquake that would bring his entire world crashing down. The silence that followed her words was a physical entity, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the gentle clinking of cutlery and the low hum of conversation. For a single stretched-out second, the universe of Aurelia held its breath. Alistair Finch, a man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets with a single utterance, was utterly, profoundly silent. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale mask of disbelief. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. He had been challenged, corrected, exposed in his own temple of power by a non-entity, a ghost in a uniform. The very foundations of his world, where status dictated truth, had just been fractured by a voice that should not have had the audacity to speak. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a servant, but an adversary whose calm, intelligent eyes held no fear, only a terrifying certainty. Elara felt the collective gaze of the room land on her like a physical weight, but it did not make her tremble. The opposite occurred. It solidified her, anchoring her to the moment. Inside her, the chaotic storm of grief and rage had subsided, leaving behind a core of absolute, crystalline clarity. The image of her father was no longer a source of pain, but a wellspring of strength. She could almost hear his voice, a gentle murmur from the past, guiding her through the analysis of a canvas, teaching her that every brushstroke tells a story, and that a lie, no matter how beautifully rendered, always betrays itself. This was not an act of vengeance born of impulse. It was the culmination of a lifetime of study, a defense of the truth her father had dedicated his life to. She stood straighter, her posture subtly shifting from the deferential stoop of a waitress to the confident bearing of an expert in her field. The cheap polyester of her uniform felt, for a moment, like academic robes. "Pardon me, Mr. Finch," she began, and the sound of her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. It was not loud, but it carried across the hushed room with the clear, ringing authority of a bell. But a painting of such supposed importance deserves to be described accurately. The words hung in the air, a direct and undeniable challenge. Finch's guest, a man named Marcus Thorne, who was considering a 9-figure investment with Finch Capital, slowly lowered his wine glass. His polite, vapid smile had vanished, replaced by an expression of sharp, analytical curiosity. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes flicking from Finch's stunned face to Elara's composed one. The power dynamic at the table had been irrevocably altered. A business transaction had suddenly become a trial, and the waitress was now the prosecution, the expert witness, and the judge, all rolled into one. "You mentioned," Elara continued, her gaze fixed not on Finch but on the painting itself, addressing it as if it were the only other sentient being in the room, the artist's revolutionary use of cerulean blue during his Parisian phase in the early 1880s. She paused, letting the statement settle. However, The specific stable, non-darkening cobalt stannate compound that produces this particular vibrant hue, she gestured almost imperceptibly with her chin, wasn't commercially synthesized and available to artists until 1895, nearly a decade after Dubois had abandoned Paris for his reclusive period in Giverny. The blue in this painting is chemically impossible for the period you described. It's too perfect, too modern. Dubois' blues from that era were notoriously unstable. They had a muted, almost melancholic quality as they aged. Her explanation was not an opinion, it was a statement of scientific and historical fact, delivered with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon. A low murmur rippled through the adjacent tables. Patrons who had been studiously ignoring the confrontation were now openly staring, their forks and knives frozen mid-air. Finch's face, once pale with shock, was now beginning to mottle with a deep, volcanic red. A single vein pulsed violently on his temple, a visible testament to the fury warring with his humiliation. He was a man accustomed to controlling every variable, to shaping reality with the sheer force of his wealth. To be unraveled by such an esoteric, undeniable detail was an experience so foreign to him that his mind struggled to formulate a response. He wanted to scream, to dismiss her with a wave of his hand, but he could see the look in Marcus Thorne's eyes. Thorne was not looking at a hysterical waitress. He was looking at a credible source, and that made Ilara dangerous. Ilara pressed her advantage, her voice remaining level and calm, a stark contrast to the barely contained violence radiating from Finch. Furthermore, there is the matter of the signature. Her eyes narrowed, her mind's eye zooming in on the flourish of letters in the bottom right corner. Jérôme Dubois, particularly in his later works, signed his name with a single, fluid, arrogant stroke of a rigger brush loaded with turpentine-thinned burnt umber. It was a mark of his supreme confidence. "The signature on this canvas," she said, her tone tinged with a clinical pity, "exhibits a microscopic but detectable hesitation before the loop of the B. It's the tremor of a forger, not the flourish of a master. It is the hand of someone copying a form, not creating it." They were concentrating so hard on getting it right that they revealed their own lack of innate ownership of the script. Marcus Thorne's gaze was now fixed on the painting's signature, a seed of doubt having been planted in the fertile ground of his financial caution. The entire premise of his investment with Finch was built on the man's supposed infallibility, his golden touch. But if Finch could be so spectacularly wrong about the crown jewel of his own collection, what other critical details might he have overlooked in the complex financial instruments he was peddling? The quiet confidence of the waitress was infinitely more compelling than the sputtering, red-faced fury of the billionaire. Thorne subtly shifted his weight in his chair, a small, almost imperceptible movement that nonetheless created a tangible distance between himself and his host. The deal, which had been all but sealed an hour ago, was now rapidly evaporating into the truffle-scented air. "And finally," Ilara said, delivering the coup de grace, "there is the canvas itself. The tight, uniform weave is characteristic of modern, machine-loomed Belgian linen. A genuine Dubois from that period would have been painted on a far more irregular, hand-stretched canvas, likely from a supplier like Père Tanguy in Paris. You would be able to see the inconsistencies, the human touch, in the warp and weft if you ran a spectral analysis. But you don't even need that. From here, I can see a perfection in its texture that simply did not exist in the 1880s. She fell silent, her case made. She had not raised her voice. She had not used a single insult. She had simply wielded the truth, a weapon against which Alistair Finch's immense fortune offered no defense. The silence that returned was heavier this time, filled with the shattered fragments of Finch's authority. She lowered her gaze, meeting his eyes for the first time since she began speaking. "It is an exquisite forgery," she concluded, her voice softening almost to a whisper, though it cut through the room like a shard of glass. but a forgery nonetheless. The finality of her declaration was absolute. There was no room for debate. In the space of 2 minutes, she had systematically and publicly dismantled the centerpiece of his power, transforming it from a priceless masterpiece into a worthless fraud. Alistair Finch, the titan of finance, the predator at the top of the food chain, had been intellectually and socially disemboweled in front of his peers, his employees, and a potential billion-dollar partner by a waitress he wouldn't have trusted to park his car. The shock finally gave way to a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated rage. Finch's composure, a carefully constructed facade of power and control, shattered into a million pieces. He shot to his feet, the legs of his chair screaming in protest against the marble floor. "You!" he snarled, his voice a low, venomous hiss that was far more menacing than a shout. He pointed a trembling finger at her, his face a mask of purple fury. "You have the audacity to stand there, in that pathetic uniform, and lecture me? Do you have any idea who I am?" His words were a desperate attempt to reassert the hierarchy she had just demolished, to remind the room that he was the one with the power, and she was the one who was nothing. He didn't wait for an answer. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the terrified maitre d', who was already rushing towards the table. "Gerard!" Finch bellowed, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Get this insolent woman out of my sight, now!" The maitre d', a man named Gerard who had worked at Aurelia for 20 years, looked from the apoplectic billionaire to the preternaturally calm waitress, his face a portrait of professional agony. He was caught in an impossible position, trapped between the restaurant's most powerful patron and an employee who had just performed an act of breathtaking, if suicidal, courage. His livelihood depended on appeasing men like Finch, and that left him with no real choice. Finch, sensing Gerard's hesitation, leaned in and delivered his ultimatum, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, threatening whisper that was audible to everyone at the table. "Fire her this instant," he hissed, his eyes boring into the maitre d's. "Or I will personally ensure that every single one of my associates, every hedge fund, every bank, and every private equity firm that matters in this city blacklists this restaurant forever. By morning, you'll be serving tourists and has-beens. Your reputation, your business will be utterly destroyed. Is that clear?" The threat was not an exaggeration. It was a promise. Alistair Finch possessed the influence to make it happen, and they both knew it. Gerard's face paled. He turned to Ilara, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and terror. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, gather your things. I'm so sorry." The apology was weak, a pathetic shield against the magnitude of his capitulation, but it was all he could offer. Ilara simply nodded. There were no tears, no pleading, no indignant outcry. She had known from the moment she chose to speak that this would be the outcome. Her job at Aurelia had always been a temporary measure, a means to an end. It had served its purpose. She had endured the indignity to pay for her father's care, and tonight she had used its stage to defend his legacy. It was a worthy trade. She turned and walked away from the table without a backward glance. She could feel the heat of Finch's glare on her back, a palpable wave of hatred. She could feel the curious, speculative eyes of Marcus Thorne following her every move. She could feel the sympathetic and fearful glances of her fellow staff members, who parted before her as if she were a ghost. The walk across the dining room, past the tables of the city's elite, was the longest of her life. Each step was a deliberate act of defiance. She had not been vanquished. She had chosen her ground, fought her battle, and accepted the consequences with her dignity intact. The heavy oak door of the restaurant closed behind her with a quiet, definitive click, shutting out the world of manufactured opulence and leaving her in the raw, honest chill of the New York night. Standing on the curb, the sounds of the city rushed in to fill the silence. The distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a subway deep beneath the pavement, the cacophony of car horns. The contrast was dizzying. Just moments ago, she had been in a gilded cage, a world insulated from reality. Now, she was back in it, unemployed, with a stack of medical bills on her small kitchen table that seemed to grow taller with each passing day. The reality of her situation came crashing down upon her with the force of a physical blow. A wave of cold, gut-wrenching despair washed over her. Had her pride been worth it? Had defending a dead artist's honor been worth jeopardizing her father's care? For a terrifying moment, she felt the crushing weight of a catastrophic mistake. She began to walk, her feet moving without conscious direction, carrying her through the canyon-like streets of Manhattan. The towering skyscrapers, glittering with a billion indifferent lights, seemed to mock her insignificance. She was just one person, a tiny, powerless speck in a city built and owned by men like Alistair Finch. He would forget her name by tomorrow, a minor annoyance already erased from his memory, while she would be left to deal with the wreckage he had created. The cold seeped through her thin uniform, and she wrapped her arms around herself, a solitary figure adrift in a sea of humanity. The despair began to crystallize into a hard, cold knot of fear in the pit of her stomach. She had spoken the truth, but the truth did not pay for physical therapy or prescription medication. Then another image rose in her mind, pushing aside the fear. It was her father, not in the hospital bed but in his gallery, years ago. He was standing before a newly acquired painting, his eyes alight with passion and reverence. He turned to a young Ilara and said, his voice filled with a quiet conviction, "Truth has a weight, Ilara. It always finds its way to the surface. Lies are light, they float for a while, but eventually they dissipate. Truth is heavy, it sinks, and it settles, and it lasts." The memory was so vivid, so powerful, that it was as if he were walking beside her on the cold pavement. His words were a lifeline, pulling her out of the drowning depths of her despair. The pieces began to click into place, not with the frantic panic of fear, but with the cold, hard logic of a scholar, Alistair Finch. A priceless, fraudulent Jérôme Dubois painting, the very same artist whose forgeries had been the instrument of her family's destruction. It was too specific, too cruel to be a coincidence. What she had harbored for years as a dark, unsubstantiated suspicion now felt like a certainty. The incident at the restaurant wasn't just a random act of arrogance. It was the echo of a much larger crime. It was the ghost of her family's ruin, appearing before her in the flesh, gloating over a trophy from a long-forgotten slaughter. She had not made a mistake. She had been given a sign. A new feeling began to displace the cold despair, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in years. It was not the hot, chaotic rage of vengeance, but something colder, purer, and far more dangerous: purpose. The fight was no longer about simply keeping her father alive. It was about reclaiming his name. It was about justice. The passive resistance she had practiced for years, working silently, enduring quietly, was over. The time for defense had passed. The time to attack had begun. By the time she reached the steps of her modest Brooklyn apartment building, the transformation was complete. The trembling, terrified woman who had stood on the curb outside Aurelia was gone. In her place was a woman with a mission, her resolve forged in humiliation and tempered by love. Inside her small, cramped apartment, the contrast with Aurelia's opulence was a physical shock. The air smelled of old books and brewing tea, not truffles and vintage Bordeaux. Stacks of art history texts covered every available surface, teetering like miniature skyscrapers. On the small kitchen table, a neat pile of white envelopes, medical bills, final notices, insurance statements, served as a constant, grim reminder of her obligations. For years, this room had been her sanctuary and her prison, the place where she studied and worried in equal measure. But tonight, it felt different. It was no longer a refuge from the world. It was a war room, the place where the counteroffensive would be planned. She sat down at the table, her movements economical and precise. She ignored the pile of bills. They were symptoms of the disease, not the disease itself. The disease was Alistair Finch. She pushed aside a stack of books, revealing an old, slightly battered laptop. She opened it, the soft glow of the screen illuminating her face, casting long shadows across the room. Her face was set in a determined mask, her eyes sharp and focused. In that moment, she shed the last vestiges of the invisible waitress. Ilara Vance, the art historian, the scholar, the daughter of Arthur Vance, had returned. Her fingers, which had spent the evening carrying trays of champagne and clearing plates, now hovered over the keyboard, ready to type the words that would begin the dismantling of a billionaire's empire. Her first act was not one of anger, but of strategy. She opened a new email, her fingers moving quickly and confidently across the keys. The recipient was a name she hadn't typed in years, a name associated with a life she thought she had left behind forever: Professor Julian Albright. He had been her PhD advisor, her mentor, a man whose brilliant, kind mind had been the guiding star of her academic career. He had been devastated when she dropped out, but he had never stopped believing in her talent. In the body of the email, she laid out the events of the evening with concise, factual clarity, stripping away the emotion and presenting only the evidence: the painting, the technical inaccuracies, Finch's name, and her terrifying suspicion of a connection to her father's ruin. She ended the email with a simple, direct plea: "I believe he is the man who destroyed my father, and I need your help to prove it." The moments after she clicked send were filled with a unique form of torment. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind the stark reality of her gamble. She was now unemployed and had just implicated one of the most powerful men in New York City in a massive fraud, based on little more than her own expertise and a gut feeling. Self-doubt, a cold and insidious serpent, began to coil in her stomach. What if Professor Albright thought she was hysterical? What if he dismissed her theory as a grief-fueled conspiracy? He was a man of academia, of peer-reviewed papers and verifiable sources. She had just sent him a wild, unbelievable story. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding with every passing second, bracing herself for silence, or worse, for a polite, dismissive reply. Less than 10 minutes later, a notification pinged, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent apartment. An email had arrived. The subject line read simply, "Of course." Her breath caught in her throat. With a trembling hand, she opened it. The message from Professor Albright was short, but it contained a universe of support. "Ilara," it began, "I have never for 1 second doubted your eye. It is the purest scholarly instrument I have ever witnessed." The world was poorer for its absence. It seems the world is about to be reminded of what it lost. I have access to the university's financial archives and historical market databases. They are not easily searched, but they are deep. When and where can we meet? The hunt is on. A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over her. She was not alone. The single greatest mind she had ever known not only believed her but was ready to join her fight. This validation was the spark that lit the fuse. The doubt vanished, replaced by a surge of energy and focus. She quickly typed a reply, and they arranged to meet the next morning in his office at the university, a place she hadn't set foot in since the day she'd abandoned her studies. It felt like a homecoming, but also like a declaration of war. She was returning to the source of her power, the world of books, archives, and evidence, to forge the weapons she would need. The next morning, sitting in Professor Albright's dusty, book-lined office, the air thick with the comforting scent of aging paper and leather, Ilara felt a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she'd been missing so desperately. Albright, a man with kind, intelligent eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, listened as she recounted the story again, this time filling in the emotional details. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his expression shifting from scholarly interest to a quiet, simmering indignation on her behalf. When she finished, he pushed a steaming cup of tea across his desk towards her. "The arrogance of men like that," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is that they believe their money makes them intelligent. They buy history, so they think they own it." You reminded him that knowledge is the one currency he can't acquire. He then turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a practiced dexterity. Finch Capital was a ghost 30 years ago, Albright explained, his eyes glued to the screen. He'd built his initial fortune on what the market called high-risk asset acquisition, a polite term for buying distressed, often morally ambiguous portfolios. Art, especially unprovenanced art, was a favorite vehicle for laundering money and hiding assets in the late 90s. The records are intentionally obscure, buried in shell corporations and offshore holding companies. But nothing is ever truly erased. He was no longer just a kind mentor. He was a fellow hunter, his academic mind perfectly suited to navigating the labyrinthine paper trails designed to conceal crimes. Ilara watched, mesmerized, as Albright pulled up arcane databases and cross-referenced obscure financial records. He was the mentor, providing the institutional access she could never have obtained on her own. He was the key that unlocked the first door. After hours of painstaking work, tracing the lineage of a dozen shell corporations with names like Aegean Holdings and Viridian Assets, they found it. A single digital ledger entry from 20 years ago, buried deep within the records of a defunct Panamanian investment fund. It was a wire transfer for $2 million from the Vance Gallery to a holding company. And the registered agent of that holding company, the ultimate beneficiary hidden behind layers of corporate deceit, was a young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless financier named Alistair Finch. They had found it. The first concrete, undeniable thread connecting Finch directly to the fraudulent sale that had destroyed her father's gallery and shattered their lives. It was the proof she had desperately needed. Staring at the glowing screen, Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. This was no longer a suspicion, it was a fact. The monster who had haunted her family from the shadows finally had a face and a name she could attach to his crime. The initial insult in the restaurant, the public humiliation, the loss of her job, all of it faded into the background, revealed as mere symptoms of this much older, deeper wound. The hunt had officially begun, and in the quiet, dusty office, surrounded by the wisdom of centuries, Ilara Vance knew with a chilling and absolute certainty that she would not stop until she had unearthed every last piece of the truth and brought the full weight of it crashing down upon him. The single ledger entry glowed on the screen, a digital ghost from 2 decades past, and yet it felt as solid and real as the heavy oak desk beneath Ilara's hands. It was the first brick in the foundation of her case, a tangible link between the abstract evil of Alistair Finch and the concrete ruin of her family. The initial euphoria of the discovery was a potent, intoxicating wave, a feeling of vindication that warmed her from the inside out. For a brief, glorious moment, it felt like enough. But as the adrenaline subsided, the cold, calculating mind of the scholar took over, pushing aside the emotional reaction of the daughter. Professor Albright, sensing the shift in her, leaned back in his creaking leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes watching her with a familiar, Socratic patience. He knew, as she was just beginning to realize, that a single wire transfer, routed through a labyrinth of offshore entities, was not a weapon. It was merely a clue. It proved a financial transaction, but it did not prove intent, it did not prove fraud, and it certainly did not prove that the paintings themselves were forgeries. In a court of law, or even in the court of public opinion, Finch's army of lawyers would dismiss it as circumstantial, a routine acquisition from a gallery that, they would argue, later failed, due to its own mismanagement. They would paint her father as incompetent, and her as a hysterical, grieving daughter seeking a deep-pocketed scapegoat. They needed more. They needed the origin, the fraudulent provenance, the very documents that were created to give the forgeries their false history. The problem, as Albright articulated in his calm, measured tones, was that such documents would be Finch's most closely guarded secrets. The wire transfer was a ghost in the machine, an electronic artifact that had survived countless server upgrades and data migrations. But the physical paperwork, the forged letters from long-dead artists, the fake receipts from 19th-century Parisian art dealers, the artificially aged certificates of authenticity that would have been handled with extreme care. It would not be languishing in some forgotten public archive. After the deal was done and the Vance Gallery was financially crippled, Finch would have either destroyed the evidence or, more likely given his arrogance, locked it away in a private vault, a trophy of his first great conquest. They had a thread, but Finch held the other end, and he had woven it into the very heart of his impenetrable corporate fortress. The search for this evidence would be like trying to find a single drop of poison in a well that had been sealed with a slab of granite. The thought was daunting, a sheer wall of impossibility that threatened to crush the fragile hope that had just been born in this dusty office. Alara felt a familiar coldness seep back into her bones, the chilling realization that the gap between knowing the truth and being able to prove it was a chasm that could swallow her whole. She was an unemployed waitress, and he was a titan who moved in a world of private security, off-site storage facilities, and non-disclosure agreements thick as novels. Their search began in the digital world, a frustrating, week-long descent into the underbelly of corporate record-keeping. Albright, with his unparalleled access to academic and historical databases, became a digital archaeologist, sifting through the layers of Finch Capital's history. They traced shell corporations, mapped out networks of holding companies, and cross-referenced the names of board members and junior executives from 20 years ago. It was a painstaking, soul-crushing process. For every potential lead, they hit a dead end. Companies had been dissolved, records had been expunged, individuals had seemingly vanished from the professional world. It was a masterclass in corporate obfuscation, a deliberate and systematic erasure of history. Alara spent her days in the university library, her nights in her small apartment, surrounded by stacks of printouts and legal documents, her world shrinking to the size of a computer screen. The city outside, with its vibrant, chaotic life, ceased to exist. There was only the hunt, the gnawing frustration, and the ever-present image of her father, his silent presence a constant reminder of the stakes. The initial momentum they had gained was slowing, the trail growing colder with each passing hour, threatening to stall completely and leave them stranded in a wasteland of digital ghosts and corporate lies. The breakthrough came not from a database, but from a flicker of human connection. While poring over a list of former junior legal associates at Finch Capital from the late 90s, Albright paused on a name, Leo Martinez. He remembered the young man from a guest lecture he had given years ago. Leo had been bright, inquisitive, and deeply idealistic, asking sharp questions about the ethics of art acquisition. He had seemed out of place even then, a man of conscience in a profession that often rewarded the opposite. A quick search revealed that Leo had left Finch Capital abruptly after only 18 months, just after the period of the Vance Gallery transaction. He had then left corporate law entirely and was now running a small, non-profit legal aid clinic in the Bronx, helping tenants fight illegal evictions. It was the profile of a man who had seen something that had shaken him to his core, a man who had walked away from a world of wealth and power because he could no longer stomach its moral compromises. He was not just a lead, he was a possibility, a potential crack in the fortress wall. He was the insider they so desperately needed, a man who might have seen the poison before the well was sealed. Finding Leo Martinez was easy. Convincing him to talk was another matter entirely. They met him in his small, cluttered office, the air thick with the smell of strong coffee and righteous indignation. The walls were covered not with expensive art, but with newspaper clippings of successful cases and thank-you notes from the families he had helped. Leo himself was older now, his face etched with the lines of 1,000 legal battles fought on behalf of the powerless, but his eyes still held the same fire Albright remembered. When Alara laid out her story, presenting the wire transfer and voicing her suspicions, Leo's face became a stony, unreadable mask. He listened intently, his gaze never leaving hers, but when she finished, he shook his head slowly. He spoke of a non-disclosure agreement so ironclad that a single word could trigger financial ruin and professional blacklisting. He explained that Finch was not just a man, He was a system, a network of influence and retribution that could reach into every corner of a person's life. To speak out against him was not an act of courage, it was an act of professional suicide. He was sympathetic, he said, but he could not help them. The risk was too great. Ilara felt her heart sink. He was their last, best hope, and the door was closing in her face. The weight of her father's future, of his legacy, pressed down on her. She saw the years stretching out before her, a bleak landscape of quiet desperation and unresolved injustice. But then, looking at this man who fought for the underdog every single day, she saw not a coward, but a man trapped by a past mistake. She decided to make one last appeal, not to the lawyer, but to the idealist she suspected still lived beneath the cynical surface. She didn't speak of revenge or even of justice. She spoke of her father. She described the man he had been, vibrant, brilliant, a man who believed in the transcendent power of beauty. She described the hollowed-out shell he had become, a man broken not by financial loss, but by the theft of his good name. She spoke of truth, the same concept Albright had invoked in his office, of its weight, its permanence. She told Leo that she wasn't asking him to tear down an empire, but simply to help her give her father back his name before it was too late. Her voice didn't tremble. It was filled with the quiet, unshakable conviction of a daughter's love. Her words hung in the air of the small office, weaving a spell of profound, undeniable emotional truth. Leo Martinez sat in silence for a long time, his gaze fixed on a faded photograph on his desk of what looked to be his own father. The stony mask on his face began to crack, revealing the conflict warring within him. He had built his new life as a penance for his time at Finch Capital, a way to balance the moral scales. But he knew, in that moment, that his silence was a form of complicity. He had walked away, but he had never truly washed his hands of it. Ilara had offered him not a risk, but a chance at redemption. Finally, he let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 20 years of silence. "Finch doesn't destroy things he considers valuable," Leo said, his voice low and raspy. "He archives them. There's an off-site document storage facility in Queens, Iron Mountain. He keeps everything there. Tax records, acquisition histories, personnel files, everything. It's his private museum of conquests." He looked up, and the fire in his eyes was burning brightly once again. "I can't get you the documents," he said, "but I still have my old security ID schematics, and I know the rotation schedule of the night guards. I can get you a 2-hour window." The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. It was one thing to be a digital archaeologist. It was another entirely to commit a felony by breaking into a high-security corporate archive. The risks were astronomical. If caught, Ilara would not be seen as a seeker of justice, but as a common criminal, a disgruntled ex-waitress with a vendetta. It would destroy any chance she had of exposing Finch, and would only serve to validate his narrative of her as an unstable, grasping hysteric. Professor Albright was vehemently against it, his protective, mentorly instincts overwhelming his scholarly curiosity. He argued for caution, for finding another way, for not meeting Finch's lawlessness with their own. But Ilara was resolute. Finch had built his empire on a foundation of lies, protected by a wall of legal and financial power. There was no conventional way through it. Sometimes, to fight a monster, you had to be willing to step into the darkness where it lived. She knew, with an instinct she couldn't explain, that the answers she needed were in that building. It was a gamble, but it was the only one she had left. The following week was a blur of meticulous, nerve-wracking preparation. Leo, now a fully committed co-conspirator, became their strategist. He provided Ilara with detailed floor plans of the Iron Mountain facility, highlighting security camera blind spots and motion sensor locations. He coached her on the protocols of the night staff, the specific cadence of their patrols, the exact moment when the shift change created a brief lapse in surveillance. He procured a forged ID badge, a masterpiece of subtle detail that would stand up to a cursory inspection. Professor Albright, despite his reservations, channeled his anxiety into his own area of expertise. He used archival science to predict the facility's organizational system, determining the most likely location of documents from that specific time period and corporate division. He created a checklist, a targeted search pattern designed to maximize Ilara's efficiency within the terrifyingly short 2-hour window. Ilara, in the meantime, prepared herself mentally. She spent hours studying the floor plans, memorizing every turn, every door, every potential hiding place, until the layout of the building was as familiar to her as her own apartment. She was no longer just an art historian, she was becoming a spy, her scholarly mind for detail now repurposed for a mission of covert infiltration. The night of the infiltration was cold and moonless, the sky over Queens a starless industrial orange. The Iron Mountain facility was a monstrous, windowless cube of concrete and steel, looming out of the darkness like a modern-day fortress. It radiated an aura of silent, intimidating security. Sitting in Albright's car a block away, watching the main gate, Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Every rational instinct screamed at her to turn back, to abandon this fool's errand. The fear was a living thing, a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. She closed her eyes and, once again, summoned the image of her father. She pictured him not in his hospital bed, but in his gallery, passionately explaining the brushstrokes of a Degas to a wide-eyed young couple. She was doing this for him, to reclaim that man from the fog of shame and defeat. The thought did not erase the fear, but it contained it, giving her a focal point, a reason to push through the terror. When the moment came, she took a deep, steadying breath, opened the car door, and stepped out into the cold night, a solitary figure walking towards the dragon's lair. Dressed in the nondescript uniform of a third-party archival service, a clipboard and the forged ID badge her only props, Ilara walked through the employee entrance with a confidence she did not feel. Her every nerve ending was on fire, her senses heightened to an almost painful degree. She could smell the sterile ozonic scent of the climate control systems, hear the low, omnipresent hum of the servers, and the distant squeak of the night guard's shoes on the polished concrete floor. The guard at the security desk barely glanced at her, his eyes glued to a small television screen. He waved her through with a grunt, and the magnetic lock on the inner door buzzed open with a deafeningly loud click. She was in. The air in the main archival hall was frigid, kept at a precise temperature and humidity to preserve the millions of documents stored within. Rows upon rows of towering metal shelves packed with identical gray document boxes stretched out before her into the cavernous darkness, a silent, perfectly ordered forest of secrets. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, a physical manifestation of the corporate power she was up against. Following the map in her mind, she moved quickly and silently through the maze of shelves, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. The only light came from the small, powerful flashlight Albright had given her, its beam cutting a nervous, dancing path through the darkness. She found the section designated for Finch Capital's historical acquisitions, the air here feeling colder, heavier, as if weighted down by the moral gravity of the secrets it held. Her hands, encased in thin cotton gloves, trembled as she ran her light over the labels on the boxes. The corporate jargon was a foreign language, FCAQ 98H, FCAQ 99V. Then she saw it. A single box, tucked away on a high shelf with a label that made her blood run cold. FCAQ, Prov, Dubois Vance. It was all there. Finch Capital, Acquisitions, Provenance. Dubois, Vance. Her entire family's tragedy, reduced to a string of letters and numbers on a cardboard box. Her quest had led her to this single, mundane object, a gray sarcophagus containing the bones of her father's life's work. With her heart pounding in her ears, she carefully lifted the heavy box from the shelf and carried it to a small, secluded alcove between two rows of shelves, a blind spot she had memorized from Leo's diagrams. She placed it on the floor and slowly, reverently, lifted the lid. The smell that wafted out was a phantom from her past, the dry, slightly acidic scent of old paper, a smell she associated with the happy, dusty archives of her father's gallery. But this was no place of joy. Inside, nestled in acid-free folders, was the evidence she had been searching for. The fraudulent provenance documents were all there, their forged signatures and artificially aged paper looking sickeningly authentic under the beam of her flashlight. There were fake letters, supposedly from Jérôme Dubois to his dealer, discussing the very paintings that had ruined her father. But there was something else, something she had not expected, something far more damning. It was a file labeled Project Masterpiece. Her hands shaking, she opened the folder. It was not just about the Vance Gallery, it was a blueprint, a business plan for a multi-year operation. It detailed the creation and distribution of a whole series of forgeries, targeting what the documents chillingly referred to as soft target legacy galleries, smaller, family-owned institutions that lacked the resources of major museums to conduct deep forensic analysis. Her father's gallery had not been the only victim. It had been the test case, the pilot program for a wider, more systematic campaign of fraud. Finch had not just committed a single crime. He had built a part of his early fortune on a foundation of artistic desecration and the destruction of honorable, trusting men like her father. The sheer, cold-blooded calculation of it all took her breath away, filling her with a rage so pure and so cold it felt like ice water flooding her veins. And then, at the very bottom of the folder, she found it, the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof. It was a single-page internal memo, dated a month before the sale to her father. It was addressed to the junior legal team, outlining the strategy for using the Panamanian shell company to distance Finch Capital from the transaction. It detailed the plausible deniability they would maintain should the forgeries ever be discovered. It was a confession, written in the dry, amoral language of corporate strategy. And at the bottom of the page, scrawled in sharp, arrogant strokes of black ink, was a signature she would recognize anywhere, a signature that had been seared into her memory for years. It was the signature of Alistair Finch. She stared at it, her flashlight beam perfectly still. He hadn't just known. He had orchestrated every last detail. She had him. She had it all. Just as she was carefully placing the memo into a hidden pocket inside her jacket, a sound echoed from the far end of the aisle, the squeak of a shoe, followed by the low murmur of a guard's voice on a radio. Her blood turned to ice. The patrol was early. Panic, sharp and electric, seized her. She quickly closed the box, her movements clumsy with haste, and slid it back onto the high shelf, her muscles screaming with the effort. She flattened herself into the shadows of the alcove, holding her breath, her heart threatening to beat its way out of her chest. The guard's footsteps grew closer, a slow, methodical rhythm that was the soundtrack to her terror. The beam of his heavy flashlight sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the shelves just feet from where she was hiding. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable shout of discovery, the end of everything. The beam passed, the footsteps continued, and then, slowly, they began to fade as the guard turned the corner at the end of the aisle. She waited, frozen, in the darkness, for what felt like an eternity before she dared to breathe again, the silence of the archive rushing back in to fill the void. Back in the safety of Professor Albright's car, the city lights smearing past the windows, Elara felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, mixed with a triumphant electric hum of victory. She had done it. She had walked into the heart of the enemy's fortress and emerged with the weapon that could destroy him. She handed the memo to Albright, who read it under the dim glow of the car's interior light. His academic composure dissolved, replaced by a look of utter disgust and fury. "This is monstrous," he whispered, his voice thick with revulsion. "This isn't just fraud. This is a sociopath's business plan. They now had everything they needed: the financial link, the physical evidence of the forgeries, and a signed confession of intent. The question was no longer what to do, but when and how. They needed a stage, a public forum from which they could detonate this bomb, ensuring the fallout would be so immense that Finch could not possibly escape it. They needed a setting that would maximize his humiliation and guarantee his destruction. The answer to their question arrived the very next morning, delivered not by a secret source but emblazoned across the front page of the Wall Street Journal's arts section. Alara saw it while grabbing a coffee, the headline leaping out at her from a newsstand. Finch to auction prize de Dubois at Christie's, silencing critics. The article detailed Alistair Finch's bold, arrogant move. Stung by what the paper called baseless rumors circulating in the art world about the authenticity of his prized painting, rumors that had clearly started after the incident at Aurelia and the subsequent flight of his investor, Marcus Thorne, Finch had decided to quell the speculation in the most public way imaginable. He was putting Soleil Couchant sur la Seine up for auction at Christie's, with a pre-sale estimate of $150 million. The auction was to be the centerpiece of the spring season, a globally publicized event. He was not just selling a painting. He was selling his own infallibility, daring anyone to challenge him. He was using his power to rewrite reality, to turn a lie into a truth through the sheer force of the market. Alara stood on the busy sidewalk, the sounds of the city fading into a dull roar, a slow smile spreading across her face. It was perfect. It was more than perfect. It was poetic. The arrogance that had been the source of her family's pain was now providing the instrument of its salvation. Finch, in his hubris, was building the stage for his own execution. He believed he was controlling the narrative, but he was actually handing her the microphone and turning on the spotlight. She looked at the smug, confident picture of Finch in the newspaper, standing beside the fraudulent painting. He thought he was untouchable, a god in his own gilded universe. He had no idea that a storm was coming for him, a storm born in the quiet grief of a daughter and armed with the undeniable heavy weight of the truth. The hunt was over. The final confrontation was set. And as she folded the newspaper and walked away, Alara Vance knew that the fall of the House of Finch was not just a possibility, it was an inevitability. The auction hall at Christie's was a cathedral consecrated to the worship of capital. Light from unseen sources bathed the room in a soft, reverential glow, glinting off the polished wood of the auctioneer's rostrum and the jewels adorning the necks of the world's wealthiest collectors. The air was still, charged with the electric tension that precedes the exchange of monumental sums of money. On a velvet-draped easel, illuminated like a sacred relic, stood Soleil Couchant sur la Seine. It looked magnificent, a lie so beautiful it commanded adoration. In the back of the room, standing in the shadows, Alara Vance felt a strange, profound calm settle over her. The frantic, terrified woman who had hidden in the darkness of the Iron Mountain archive was gone. In her place was a vessel of pure, cold purpose. Her heart did not hammer against her ribs. It beat with a slow, steady, deliberate rhythm, a war drum counting down the final moments of Alistair Finch's reign. Beside her, Professor Albright gave her hand a reassuring squeeze, his presence a silent testament to his unwavering belief in her. Across the room she saw Finch himself, seated in the front row, a triumphant, proprietary smirk playing on his lips as he watched the numbers on the digital display climb higher and higher, each bit a further validation of his power, a further burial of his original crime. He was not just selling a painting, he was selling a narrative, a reality he had manufactured, and the world was eagerly buying it. He was so close to his final victory, so blinded by the glare of his own hubris, that he never once scanned the crowd for the ghost of his past. The bidding was a frantic, bloodless battle, a series of subtle nods and raised paddles that sent the price soaring into the stratosphere. $70 million, $85 million, $100 million. The auctioneer's voice, a smooth, hypnotic baritone, narrated the ascent, each number a hammer blow of confirmation for Finch. When the bid reached 120 million, a hushed awe fell over the room. The auctioneer paused for dramatic effect, letting the staggering figures sink in. $120 million, he repeated, his voice resonating with the weight of history. A new world record for the master, Jérôme Dubois. This was the moment. It was the peak of Finch's arrogance, the absolute zenith of his public triumph. This was the point from which the fall would be the most spectacular. Elara met the eyes of a woman standing near the press section, a seasoned investigative journalist from the Times whom Albright had contacted, a woman who had built her career on exposing the very kind of corruption Finch embodied. The journalist gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. A technician, a quiet ally the journalist had positioned, discreetly handed Elara a wireless microphone. She took a deep breath, the cold, conditioned air of the auction hall filling her lungs. The calm within her was absolute. She was not just a daughter seeking justice. She was an instrument of historical truth, and the time for that truth had finally come. She pressed the small button on the microphone, and her voice, clear, steady, and amplified, sliced through the reverential silence of the room. Before you bring down the hammer on a fraud of $120 million, Elara's voice boomed from the speakers, you should know that the painting you are bidding on is utterly, demonstrably worthless. A collective gasp swept through the hall. Every head swiveled in her direction, a sea of shocked and scandalized faces. The auctioneer froze, his gavel held aloft, his professional poise shattered. In the front row, Alistair Finch's triumphant smirk dissolved, replaced by a mask of stunned, venomous disbelief. He whipped his head around, his eyes finding her in the shadows, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine, primal fear entered his gaze. He saw her, not as the waitress from Aurelia, but as a specter he could not identify, an unknown variable that threatened his perfectly controlled world. Before he or the stunned security guards could react, Elara continued, her voice gaining strength and authority with every word. And I have the proof. At her signal, the journalist's technician hit a key on his laptop. The massive screen behind the auctioneer, which had been displaying a beautiful high-resolution image of the painting, flickered and changed. An image of a spectral analysis report appeared, a series of complex graphs and chemical compositions. What you see here, Elara announced, her voice echoing with the dispassionate authority of a lecturer, is a pigment analysis of the cerulean blue used in the water. It shows a stable cobalt-stannate compound that, as any reputable art historian knows, was not commercially available to artists until 1895. This painting is dated 1883. The blue in this painting is chemically, historically, and factually impossible. A wave of murmurs and frantic whispers erupted through the crowd. Art dealers and collectors were pulling out their phones, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Finch had scrambled to his feet, his face turning a blotchy, apoplectic red. "Security!" he roared, his voice cracking with fury and panic. "Get her out of here! This is absurd! This is slander!" But no one moved. The entire room was captivated, their attention locked on the screen as it changed again, this time displaying two documents side by side. On the left was a known, genuine letter from Jérôme Dubois. On the right was one of the forged provenance letters from the box Elara had taken from the archive. On the right, Elara's voice cut through his sputtering, is the fraudulent provenance document Alistair Finch has used for 20 years to legitimize this forgery. As you can see, when compared to a genuine sample, the forger made a critical error, using a paper stock containing bleached wood pulp, a process not widely used in France until the early 20th century. Then came the final, devastating blow. The screen changed one last time, displaying a high-resolution image of the internal memo from Project Masterpiece. And there, at the bottom, blown up to a monstrous size for the entire world to see, was Alistair Finch's arrogant, unmistakable signature. "This," Elara declared, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's sentence, is an internal memo from Finch Capital, dated 20 years ago. It outlines the entire criminal conspiracy to create a series of forgeries, to target smaller family-owned galleries, and to use offshore shell corporations to launder the money. This painting was not an acquisition. It was the weapon used in the financial slaughter of my father, Arthur Vance, of the Vance Gallery. The name, once so respected in their world, hung in the air, a ghost returned to claim its justice. The chaos that erupted was absolute. The sound of 100 camera shutters firing at once was like a volley of machine gun fire, all of it aimed at Alistair Finch. He stood frozen, a statue of impotent rage, his face a ghastly shade of white. The evidence was irrefutable. His own signature, a signed confession projected for the entire art world to witness. His carefully constructed universe of power, intimidation, and manufactured reality had been utterly demolished in the space of 90 seconds. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a choked, gurgling sound emerged. His eyes, wide with terror, darted around the room, but he found no allies, only the cold, condemning stares of his peers and the hungry lenses of the press. He was no longer a titan, a predator, a king in his castle. He was just a common criminal, a cheap fraudster exposed in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. He stumbled backward, his legs seeming to give way, and collapsed into his seat, his body shrinking in on itself as if trying to disappear. The digital display still glowed with the triumphant figure of $120 million, a final, mocking testament to the scale of his fraudulent ambition. The auction was over, his career was over, his life as he knew it was over. The truth, heavy and undeniable, had finally settled, and it had crushed him completely. Type "Justice" in the comments if you got chills when Alara Vance finally exposed the truth. The ensuing media firestorm was more like a nuclear detonation. The story was a global sensation, a perfect fable for the modern age, the brilliant, forgotten daughter of a ruined man bringing down a corrupt billionaire with nothing but her knowledge and her courage. The SEC immediately launched a full-scale investigation into Finch Capital, freezing its assets and uncovering a decades-long history of fraud and manipulation that went far beyond the art world. Lawsuits from other victims, emboldened by Alara's stand, materialized overnight, a flood of righteous claims that dismantled Finch's empire piece by piece. Alistair Finch, the man who had moved through the world like a conquering king, was reduced to a pathetic figure, hounded by reporters, abandoned by his associates, and ultimately facing a litany of federal charges that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in a world of concrete and steel, a cage of his own making. His fall was not just financial, it was biblical, a complete and satisfying erasure of a man who had built his legacy on the ruins of others. In the quiet aftermath of the storm she had unleashed, Ilara's own world began to transform. The day after the auction, she received a call from the president of Christie's. He was mortified, apologetic, but also deeply, profoundly impressed. He spoke of integrity, of the vital importance of truth in their world, and of his desire to ensure such a catastrophic breach of trust could never happen again. He didn't just offer her a job, he offered her a mission. He asked her to create and lead a new, independent department of authentication and provenance research, giving her the resources and authority to be the ultimate guardian of the institution's integrity. She accepted. The position was not just a job, it was the culmination of her life's purpose, a way to use the gift her father had given her not just to honor his memory, but to protect the entire world he had loved so dearly. The salary was more than she could have ever imagined. A stream of resources that meant the grim calculus of medical bills was finally, blessedly, over. She could now give her father the best care money could buy, in a quiet, sunlit facility where he would be treated with the dignity he had always deserved. Her new life was not about revenge, but about restoration. She sold her small apartment in Brooklyn and moved into a beautiful, light-filled brownstone, turning one entire floor into a private library, a sanctuary of books and knowledge. But her greatest triumph was not the job or the money. It was a quiet afternoon at the rehabilitation center. She sat beside her father, holding his hand, and read aloud from the front page of the New York Times. The headline was simple: Arthur Vance exonerated as Finch forgery ring exposed. She read the article slowly, her voice steady, recounting the story of his vindication, the complete and total restoration of his good name. For a long time he was silent, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. But then, he turned his head and looked at her. A flicker of the old light, the brilliant, passionate spark she thought was gone forever, returned to his eyes. He squeezed her hand, a single, weak but deliberate gesture. And in that small, silent act of recognition, of pride, of love, Alara Vance found her true reward. She had not only defeated a monster and reclaimed her own future, she had given her father back his soul, completing the sacred promise she had made to him in the darkest of times. If Alara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.